The night Phoebe turned 34, she sat in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons on Dufferin Street and cried into a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Not because anything dramatic had happened. That was the worst part. Nothing dramatic had happened at all. Inside their apartment, the dinner she'd spent 3 hours preparing was sitting on the stove, going cold in the same way the coffee was going cold in her hands. Roasted chicken, the kind her mother used to make on Sundays. Garlic mashed potatoes, a birthday cake, store-bought because she hadn't had time to bake, but she'd at least pick the right kind, the one with the lemon filling he always said he liked. Martin hadn't come home. He hadn't called either. Not until 9:15, when she was already in her coat and halfway out the door, when he finally sent a text. Not even a call, a text, that said, "Running late, don't wait up." It was her birthday. She had told him 3 times that week. She had even put it in the shared calendar on their phones, the one he claimed he never checked, the one that was supposed to solve exactly this kind of problem. She drove to Tim Hortons because she didn't know where else to go. She ordered a medium double-double and sat in her car and watched the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement and thought, "Is this it? Is this actually my life?" Phoebe had met Martin Ashworth at a house party in Waterloo when she was 22 years old and in her final year of environmental science. He was charming in that way. Some men are charming. Confident, funny, the kind of person who made a whole room feel like it was in on a joke with him. She had laughed at something he said about the music playing, and he had looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. She had believed him. That was the thing. She had genuinely believed him. They moved to Toronto together after graduation. It was supposed to be temporary, just until Martin got his consulting business off the ground, until they figured out where they actually wanted to settle. But the temporary became 2 years, then 4, then 6. They got a dog, a rescue named Biscuit, who had 1 torn ear and a talent for finding trouble. They got engaged at Niagara-on-the-Lake on a weekend trip that Martin had planned down to the last detail. The restaurant, the ring, the walk along the water. It had been genuinely beautiful. Phoebe had cried. She cried now too, but for different reasons. The wedding was small. A backyard ceremony in June at her parents' place in Guelph. Her mother, Sandra, had strung fairy lights through the apple trees. Her father, Gordon, had given a speech that made everyone laugh and then cry, which was exactly the kind of speech Gordon gave. Martin's family flew in from Calgary, polite and well-dressed and a little hard to read. His mother, Elaine, hugged Phoebe and said she looked beautiful, and Phoebe had no reason then to think that meant anything other than what it said. The first year of marriage was fine. The second year was when things started to shift, so slowly that Phoebe didn't have a name for it, couldn't point to a single moment and say, "There, that's when it changed." It was more like a tide going out. You don't notice it happening. You just look up one day and realize the water is very far away. Martin worked long hours. She understood that. She worked long hours, too, at the environmental consulting firm where she'd landed a position she actually cared about. But his long hours came with a kind of weight that he brought home and set down in the middle of the apartment, so that everything arranged itself around it. The mood at dinner depended on how his day had gone. The weekend plans depended on how tired he was. If he was irritable, the apartment grew careful and quiet. If he was expansive, everything was warm and easy, and Phoebe would catch herself thinking, "This is good. This is the real version of us." She stopped inviting her work friends over, because Martin found social gatherings exhausting after a full week. She stopped signing up for the Saturday morning trail runs she used to love, because Martin slept late on Saturdays and the alarm would wake him. She stopped keeping wine in the fridge. White, the kind she liked, because he preferred red and called her preferences childish. A word he said with a small laugh, as though it were a joke, as though she should be in on it. She didn't notice herself disappearing. That was the honest truth. You don't notice it when it happens gradually enough. What she did notice eventually was that she was very tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, the kind that sat underneath everything. She started waking up at 5 in the morning for no reason, staring at the ceiling while Martin slept beside her, his breathing slow and even completely unbothered. She started writing in a journal, something she hadn't done since university. Just notes, really, fragments of thought. What she'd felt that day, what she wished she'd said, what she missed about herself. Reading those entries back later was like getting a letter from someone she'd almost forgotten. Her closest friend, a woman named Talia, who she'd known since high school, and who had a gift for saying the true thing in a way that didn't leave a mark, asked her once, over drinks in Kensington Market, "Does he make you feel good about yourself?" Phoebe had laughed it off. She'd said something like, "It's complicated." which is what you say when the answer is no and you're not ready to say it out loud. The year she turned 32, Phoebe was offered a promotion at work, senior project lead. It would mean longer hours and more travel, but it was also the thing she'd been quietly working toward for 4 years. She came home and told Martin over dinner, barely able to sit still. He listened. He nodded. Then he asked who would look after Biscuit when she was traveling. That was his first question. Not, congratulations. Not, I'm proud of you. Just, who would look after the dog? She took the promotion anyway. It seemed important not to let that moment be the thing that stopped her. But something shifted between them after that, a tension she couldn't quite name, like a hinge that was slightly off and made a sound every time you opened the door. Martin started making comments. Small ones, slipped into ordinary conversation. You're never home anymore. I feel like I'm living alone. I don't know why you care so much about this job when we could just start a family and simplify things. The word simplify always made her stomach tighten. She had a feeling she knew what he meant by it. She didn't want to know what he meant by it. The spring she turned 33, she found out she was pregnant. It was unexpected. They hadn't been trying, hadn't really discussed it in any concrete way. She sat in the bathroom at 7 in the morning with the test in her hand and felt something complicated and warm move through her. She was scared. She was also quietly excited. She thought about calling Talia before she told Martin, just to say it out loud to someone safe first. She told Martin instead, at breakfast. He was reading something on his phone. She said, I'm pregnant. He looked up. A long pause. Then, are you sure that's what you want to do right now? With work the way it is. Phoebe had a miscarriage 6 weeks later. Martin drove her to the hospital, sat in the waiting room, drove her home. He was present in the technical sense. He made tea. He did not hold her while she cried. He slept on his side of the bed with his back to her, and in the morning he said, gently, that maybe it was for the best, given everything. She did not speak to him for 3 days after that. Not because she chose to, she simply had nothing left. That was the beginning. Or maybe it was the middle. It's hard to know, looking back, where the actual beginning was. She threw herself into work. There is a kind of salvation in being useful, in having a problem in front of you that you can actually solve, and Phoebe found it in the long hours at her desk, in the site visits and the client calls, and the satisfaction of doing something that mattered. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. That at least Martin couldn't take from her. But at home, the atmosphere had changed again. Colder now, more deliberate. He criticized the way she organized the kitchen. He complained about her spending. Even though she earned more than he did and had for the past 2 years, a fact that was never spoken but sat in the room between them, enormous and unacknowledged. He made a remark once, in front of his colleague Derek and Derek's wife, about how Phoebe had never really figured out the whole cooking thing. She smiled at the table and said nothing and excused herself to the bathroom and stood there for 2 minutes looking at herself in the mirror. She drove home from that dinner in silence. Martin talked the whole way. He was in a good mood. He'd had a productive evening. At the Tim Hortons parking lot, on her 34th birthday, Phoebe held her cold coffee and thought about that dinner. She thought about the miscarriage. She thought about the promotion question. She thought about 5 years of Saturdays arranged around someone else's tiredness. 5 years of white wine quietly removed from the fridge. 5 years of a journal that kept asking the same questions and never getting different answers. She thought about something Talia had said once, something Phoebe had filed away and not quite let herself look at. You know what's strange? You seem happiest when he's out of town. Phoebe had laughed at the time. It wasn't funny now. She sat in that parking lot for a long time. The rain picked up. People came and went through the glass doors, collars up against the cold. A woman pushed a stroller past the window, looking down at her phone, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass. Just a second, a stranger's face. And Phoebe felt, suddenly and without warning, a kind of unbearable grief for everything she hadn't let herself want. She drove home. Martin was already asleep. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the chicken, dry and cold on the stove. She looked at the birthday cake with the lemon filling. She thought, he didn't even ask if I ate. She put a slice of cake on a plate and ate it standing at the counter in the dark, just her and the distant sound of traffic through the window, and it was one of the loneliest things she had ever done. But somewhere underneath the loneliness, so quiet she almost missed it, something else was waking up. The decision didn't come all at once. That's what people don't understand about decisions like this. They think there's a single moment, a lightning bolt, a door slamming. There isn't. There's a long, slow accumulation of small things, and then one day the weight is just more than you can carry anymore, and you set it down. For Phoebe, the weight became impossible to carry on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She had been at a site in Hamilton all morning, doing field assessments in the kind of November cold that gets into your coat and stays there. She was tired and muddy and genuinely satisfied. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing real work in the world. On the drive back to Toronto, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. It was Elaine, Martin's mother. They hadn't spoken in months, not since a tense family dinner in August, where Martin had talked over Phoebe twice in front of everyone, and Elaine had watched it happen without a word. The silence between them since then had been mutual and unaddressed. But Elaine was calling now, and something in her voice was careful in a way that made Phoebe's hands tighten on the steering wheel. "I need to tell you something," Elaine said. "And I need you to know that I'm telling you, because I think you deserve to know, not because I want to cause trouble. There is a specific quality to the moment before your world changes shape. A hush, a held breath." Elaine told her that Martin had been seeing someone, for almost a year, a woman named Courtney who worked at the firm he consulted for in Mississauga, who Phoebe had met exactly once, at a holiday party, and who had seemed entirely ordinary. Elaine had found out through a cousin who'd seen them at a restaurant in Oakville, and she had spent 2 weeks deciding whether to say anything. "I'm sorry," Elaine said. "I know this isn't easy." Phoebe drove the rest of the way to Toronto in a silence so complete it had a physical quality. She did not cry. She was past the part of herself that cried, she thought. Of course, not because she'd known exactly, but because it explained so many things that she'd spent years explaining differently. The coldness, the constant low-level contempt, the way he'd made her feel for years like she was the problem, the thing that was slightly wrong, the one who needed to adjust and simplify and disappear a little more each season. He hadn't been dissatisfied with the marriage. He'd been building an exit, and while he built it, he'd made sure she stayed small enough not to get in the way. She did not go home. She drove instead to Talia's apartment in Leslieville, parked crooked in a no-parking zone, rang the buzzer 3 times. Talia opened the door in sweatpants with a glass of red wine in her hand, and one look at Phoebe's face was enough. "Come in," Talia said. "Tell me everything." She told her everything. She told her about the parking lot birthday and the miscarriage and the promotion question, and the dinner with Derek, and the journal full of the same unanswered question. She told her about Elaine's phone call. She told her about the 5 years of white wine removed from the fridge, and why somehow that was the detail that kept coming back to her. Talia listened. She did not say "I told you so," which was one of the many reasons Phoebe loved her. At some point, Talia put a glass of wine in Phoebe's hand, white, the kind she liked, and said, "So what do you want to do?" And for the first time in a very long time, Phoebe let herself think about what she actually wanted. She didn't go back to the apartment that night. She called in sick the next morning, the first time in 4 years, and spent the day at Talia's kitchen table with a laptop, looking at leases and legal separation processes, and savings accounts she hadn't thought about in years. She called her mother in Guelph. Sandra answered on the second ring, and Phoebe said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." And then she cried, finally, the kind of crying that had been waiting for months. "Oh, sweetheart," Sandra said. "Come home. Not come home and cook, not come home and clean. Just come home." 2 words, but the right ones. The ones that meant, "You are not alone in this. You never were. We are here." Phoebe drove to Guelph that afternoon with Biscuit in the back seat. She was taking the dog. That was not a question, and pulled into the driveway of the house she'd grown up in as the sun was going down behind the elm trees. Her father came out before she'd even turned off the engine. He didn't say anything. He just hugged her in the driveway, the way he'd hugged her after hard days when she was a teenager. And she let herself be held. She stayed in Guelph for 2 weeks. She slept in her old bedroom with Biscuit at the foot of the bed. She ate her mother's cooking and helped Gordon rake the leaves in the backyard, and sat at the kitchen table in the evenings talking about ordinary things. The Neighbors, a movie her parents had seen, a recipe Sandra had been trying. Small ordinary things that felt, after years of careful silence, almost unbearably sweet. Martin texted twice. Both times, "When are you coming back?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "We need to talk." Just, "When are you coming back?" as though she were a convenience that had temporarily relocated. She did not answer. Her cousin Bridget name only, she thought with a start, remembering the file. No, not that name. Her friend from university, a woman named Isla. She stopped herself. She let the quiet settle. On the 10th day in Guelph, she called a lawyer in Toronto named Patricia. No, a lawyer. She found a family lawyer recommended by someone at her firm, a woman with a calm voice and clear answers, and they spoke for an hour about what a separation would look like, practically and legally, given their shared assets and the length of the marriage. The lawyer said things like equalization payment and matrimonial home and net family property. And Phoebe took notes and did not feel afraid. She felt, instead, a strange steadiness, like standing on solid ground after years of shifting sand. She told Martin by phone. She had not planned it that way. She'd meant to do it in person, but he called on a Sunday morning with an edge in his voice that made it easier to say over the phone, "I'm not coming back. I want to separate." A silence. Then, "Are you serious right now?" Not a question. A statement, the kind that meant, "This is an inconvenience I have not scheduled." "Yes," Phoebe said. "I'm serious," he argued. He cycled through stages quickly. Anger, then a brief bewildering pivot to something that sounded almost like remorse, then back to anger. He said she was overreacting. He said she was making a decision based on something his mother had said, and his mother had always had a difficult relationship with the truth. He said she had always been too sensitive, that she had never understood the kind of pressure he was under. Phoebe listened to all of it. She held the phone and looked out her parents' kitchen window at the backyard where she'd grown up, at the apple trees her mother had strung with fairy lights for her wedding, bare now in the November cold, and she felt something inside her go very, very quiet. "I know," she said when he had finished. "I know you see it that way." She hung up. People talk about leaving like it's the hard part, and it is hard. Phoebe won't pretend otherwise. The logistics were exhausting. There were weeks of back and forth with lawyers, decisions about the apartment and shared accounts and Biscuit's vet records. There were difficult conversations with people who had opinions. Martin's friends, mostly, a few of whom she'd thought were her friends too. There were nights in Guelph when she lay awake and wondered if she'd made a mistake, not because she wanted to go back, but because moving forward required a kind of courage she wasn't sure she had. But the other side of leaving was this. She started to recognize herself again. It came back in pieces. The Saturday trail runs came back first. She found a running group in Guelph through an app, strangers, who gathered at 7 in the morning regardless of weather, people who didn't know anything about her except that she showed up. She started going every week. After a month, some of them were her friends. She joined a book club that met at a wine bar on Gordon Street and drank white wine every second Thursday and argued about novels with a passionate disagreement she found deeply refreshing. She took Biscuit to the dog park and talked to other dog owners in the uncomplicated way you talk to strangers who share a specific joy. She called her mother from the office at lunchtime sometimes, just to talk. She went to see her college roommate in Vancouver for a long weekend and walked along the seawall and felt genuinely and without qualification glad to be alive. 6 months after she left, she found an apartment in Toronto, a one-bedroom in the East End, 3rd floor, a window in the bedroom that faced east so the morning light came in first thing. She painted the living room a color called muted sage that Talia said looked like a podcast studio, and Phoebe said looked like calm, and they were both right. She put white wine in the fridge. She bought the kind she liked. She thought about Martin sometimes, less and less as the months went on. She heard through people they both knew that he and Courtney were still together, that they'd moved to Mississauga. She felt, when she heard this, almost nothing, which was not the same as nothing, but was close enough. What she thought about more was the parking lot on Dufferin Street, the cold coffee, the birthday cake eaten standing up in the dark. She thought about that version of herself, 34 years old, coat still on, crying over a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and she felt for her a tenderness that still surprised her sometimes, because that woman in the parking lot had been on the edge of something. She hadn't known it then. She'd thought she was just tired, just sad, just having a bad birthday. But something in her had already started to know that the way she was living was not the same as being alive. There is a postscript to this story, one that Phoebe almost didn't tell because it still catches her off guard when she thinks about it. A year and a half after the separation, she was at a fundraising dinner for a conservation organization she'd started volunteering with. One of the things she'd taken up in the new life. Something that felt like the work she'd meant to do with herself all along. She was seated next to a man named Stephen, who turned out to be a high school geography teacher from Oshawa, who had recently moved back to Toronto, and who talked about the boreal forest with a genuine reverence that she found unexpectedly moving. They talked through most of the dinner. He was not the kind of charming that fills a room. He was the kind that makes one other person feel like they are the only person in it. And he did it without seeming to try, which Phoebe had learned to notice was the difference. She did not fall in love with him that night, but she did go home thinking about the conversation. She thought about how easy it had been, how uncomplicated, how she had laughed, real laughter, 3 or 4 times, and hadn't once monitored herself. She saw him again at the next volunteer event, and the one after that. She is not going to tell you how that story ends, partly because it is still being written and partly because it was never the point. The point was never the ending. The point was the parking lot, the cold coffee. The moment Phoebe looked at her own life and thought, I am worth more than this. I have always been worth more than this. And it is not too late. She was 34 years old. She had a dog with one torn ear and a jar of white wine in the fridge and a window that faced east. She had, for the first time in a long time, a life that was actually hers. And that, it turned out, was enough to begin with.